So I'm Sander Goossens from NASA Goddard, giving this presentation indeed on behalf of Dave and the co-authors listed here. And we wanted to investigate what gravity can contribute to the Artemis program, and specifically because gravity is related to density, that immediately gets into can gravity contribute to the identification of water ice. So next slide, please. So the context and rationale of this research is that we recognize that long-term survival on the lunar surface will largely depend on the availability of natural resources, but it may very well be that it's unlikely that there are sufficient and necessary resources available in the very top few meters of the surface. And in that case, you'll need to look deeper. Things like mining might be necessary. And that gets at to kilometer scales, which are the scales that gravity can inform us. And so therefore gravity could be an important and necessary tool. And in that context, we wanted to highlight what we can currently do and what the future might be able to extract from gravity, basing now on GRAIL results, of course. Next slide, please. So these are the data sets that we used in this analysis. It's based on topography, which you'll see on the left, which is the Lola dam, and we've limited ourselves here to a south polar stereographic projection down to 80 degrees, focused on the South Pole, and indicated the 13 candidate landing sites. And on the right, you see what's called Bouguer gravity, which is really the free air gravity as it was determined from GRAIL minus the contribution by topography. And I'll explain that in a little while, a little bit into detail. And what you see here specifically also is that we've band filtered it in the spherical harmonic domain. So we express gravity in spherical harmonics. Those are the functions that describe signals on the sphere. And that is related to degrees and orders, which describe the resolution. Usually one one relates spherical harmonics to surface resolution, for example. And so here we focus us on degrees 270 to 700, which we list below as 2.5 to 6.4 kilometers. But rather than looking at surface resolution, we now look at depth through a relationship between spherical harmonic degrees and depth that we published earlier this year in Geophysical Journal International. And it just comes down to that there's a mapping of spherical harmonic degrees to depth. And in this case, these degrees, so we focused on 270 to 700 because that gets down to the really top layers of the crust of the moon, which would be important for this project. Lower degrees would be relating to the deeper interior, but we're not interested for this work. So next slide, please. So our data sets, as said, are Bouguer gravity of the moon, and we're going to look at gravity spectra that I'll explain. So we used the latest model that we developed. It's a degree and order 1200 gravity field model, and it's Bouguer, so it's free air minus gravity from topography, for which we use a nominal density of the crust of 2500 kilograms per cubic meter. That's roughly the average density of the lunar crust. We're going to look at the gravity spectrum that I'll explain of each of those 13 locations. We investigate them from degree 2 to 1200, and that corresponds to a depth range of 1.5 to about 250 kilometers, but we're mostly interested in the upper parts of the crust. So another thing is that we evaluate the gravity field at a radius of 1742 kilometers, which is about 4 kilometers higher than the average radius that we use for gravity. And the reason for that is that because of rather large topographic variations, one really should just evaluate the spherical harmonics on a surface that encloses the entire mass of the moon. In that case, that would mean even higher than 1742 kilometers, somewhere about 1748 kilometers. If not, there can be convergence issues, and we're especially interested in the really high degrees of the gravity field. So we try to find a compromise by evaluating it slightly higher, in order to get rid of a lot of the noise signal that would otherwise be in the gravity that I'll show. And so we're going to focus our interest primarily on the 1.5 to 5 kilometers depth range below the surface, and that means the really high degrees of the gravity field expansion. So next slide, please. So yeah, we can skip this as well, because these are the 13 locations which are, I'm pretty sure, familiar. Here they are listed with their coordinates in longitude, latitude, and the thing I want to point out here is the radius column where you can see that a lot of them are fairly close to that 1738 kilometers. A few are above the 1742 that we chose to evaluate the gravity from. And again, this is to try and minimize the effect of noise on the signals that we're interested in. So next slide, please. And this is what the gravity spectra, as we call them, look like. We show 3 sites here, but they basically look very similar for all 13, which isn't that surprising since they're all, of course, in the same fairly close together area. What we see here is an example of what's called individual profiles. So when we have gravity, we express them in spherical harmonics, and usually it's a summation to express the gravity signal from a degree 2 all the way up to a certain degree. And as you go up to higher degrees, you get more and more resolution, more and more small details at the surface. Here, it's what we call an individual profile. It's really just the gravity per degree. It's a little bit difficult to imagine what that means, but we looked at this in order to see what's happening underneath basins. And that was, for example, work that was presented by Dave Smith earlier at the LPSC. There we were really interested in what happens at the low degrees. And you can see here that there's variations which are fairly similar for all of those sites. That could tell us something about the density structure beneath the basins. We're not going to look at that in this case here. We're going to more look at the higher parts, which is indicated by the dotted line and the big arrows going up. And you can see there that everything looks fairly benign, fairly straightforward. Partly is that also the reason that, of course, we know from Grail that the upper part of the crust is largely fractured and rather homogeneous, although there are, of course, small-scale density variations in there. Next slide, please. So out of the 13 sites, what we did here is what we called cumulative downward profiles. And again, gravity is expressed as a summation of spherical harmonics, where normally you sum them up from degree 2, the very lowest part, all the way up to a maximum degree. Here we sort of do it the other way around, and the rationale behind that is that if we start summing things at 1200, so for example, on the profiles here, if you take the line at degree 1000, which is the left axis, that would mean that we were looking at gravity contributions from 1000 to 1200. The idea there is that we sort of start at the surface and work our way back with our depth relationship, where we relate degrees to depth, sort of looking top down from the surface of the moon towards the center. And that's why here we're interested really in these high degrees. So we only plot them here from 1200 to about 600. And you can see we selected these sites here because we saw some interesting signals here. The others look a little bit more noisy or not much going on. For these sites, without having done any further analysis, we already noticed that there are some strong systematic trends. And because we're looking at gravity, those could be related, for example, to density variations. And that's why we selected these ones here. And for several of the sites, you can see that the actual noise level on the signal seems to be fairly similar for all of them, but they show some different kind of signals until at about 600 degrees, 600, 700, they sort of merge to a more stable value. So parts above that could indicate some variations going along in the upper crust, although we are also still aware, of course, very well that we are looking at the edge of noise. It should be said, though, that for the South Pole, the Grail gravity fields are really good because of confluence of the spacecraft tracks. So that means that there were just a lot of data taken, and we know that Grail flew at low altitude, so it was very sensitive to also the really high degree, the high resolution parts of the gravity field. Next slide, please. Because we're looking at Bouguer, it's largely driven by whatever we chose for the crustal density of the moon. In this case, it was 2,500. And so we also evaluated profiles for a different density, in this case, 2,000 kilogram. And we saw some shifts, and that gave us the idea that we could compare profiles for different densities in order to get at the sensitivity of these profiles in terms of milligauss to the crustal density used. And so we did a very simple estimation where we assumed a linear relationship between Bouguer gravity and density at a given degree. And that means that we have, for example, two values, one for a density at 2,500, one for a density at 2,000. And then we can minimize, basically set the Bouguer to 0, which would mean that we would get at the right density in order to cancel out the Bouguer at that particular point. And in that sense, we were able to obtain densities In fact, for all of the 13 sites, but it turned out that for the ones that we identified that looked interesting just by the way the profiles looked, we could also get some actually reasonable values for the density, and they're listed here. Now, this is, of course, a very simple, straightforward way of getting at the density, so these results aren't final at all, but they do show some interesting results, especially site 2, of course, has a very low density, which immediately makes one think of water ice, but I would not necessarily take that conclusion now. It's mostly that the other sites have some interesting densities that are slightly lower than the average density of the moon's crust. Next slide, please. And so here we highlight again those sites that we found results for, and they also are in a bit of the similar area, an area with sometimes large topography, so that should also be taken into account. There could still be noise on the gravity profiles, but also in areas of pronounced gravity field signal. Next slide, please, and that'll be the last one, I think. So in conclusions, gravity, we think, provides additional information about each site. It's related to density. There's still a lot of work to be done, so we don't recommend it necessarily now as a factor to be used in the selection of priority of preference for sites. But the results are interesting. It suggests density might decrease slightly immediately below the surface. We see that elsewhere on the moon as well, but that's mostly on under mare areas, for example. And of course, the results suggest that some in situ measurements of gravity might be important in order to have a look at the more deeper structures in the moon. So what we mainly want to highlight here is that gravity shouldn't be overlooked. The GRAIL results are there. They're really good at the South Pole, and they can tell us a lot about the subsurface structure at the South Pole. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sander. We have one question in the chat, which is tangentially related to the search for water ice, but it's a question about how gravity can possibly affect inbound trajectories.
Of the landers, or?
Yes.
Well, yeah. Although I imagine a lot of that will be done more with in situ navigation and local features, but yeah, gravity is a large driver for the forces acting on the spacecraft, of course.
Okay, possibly we can come back to that during discussion.
Yeah.